welcome you today to our panel, Leadership Ethics 2.0. I learned a long time ago if you can fit your panel title in with the overall theme of the conference, I think that's important. That's my theory. You can test it out. But I really do think our presentation today fit in with the theme of the conference. Where have we been? What's cutting edge? Where do we need to be? In putting the panel together, I did have a hidden or secret agenda, and that is I always want to keep ethics at the forefront of ILA because I feel it's so important. We have a session this afternoon at 2:45. Those can cross various interest groups if you're interested in that, and that's taking place at
Salon H, 2:45. Putting together an ethics group, possibly. So all of you are welcome to come to that. Thanks.
Our format's very simple today. We're going to take about 20 minutes. That should leave 15, 20 minutes for interaction. So you're the respondent today. I hope you're kind respondents. Any questions and further dialogue, because we wanted to leave that time. I'm Craig Johnson from George Fox University. First question is where to have the stats. It's outside of Portland, Oregon, as you head to the coast. And we have Terry Price from the University of Richmond and George Reed from University of San Diego. And you can read more about them in the program. We're going to basically follow the order that's in the program. So I'm going to begin. And my focus today is on ethical crisis leadership. And I think it's a good topic for us today and does fit well in with the conference because what we're finding is that there are more crises occurring. Well, how do you measure that? I'm always cautious about that because I think, well, in the 1300s we didn't have the media. There probably was so many crises. But there do appear to be more significant industrial accidents happening, those that involve 50 or more deaths. Because of greater complexity of society, we've built in more crises. There's more potential for computer equipment, as we've all probably discovered as we've taught. It makes us long. When it works, it's great, but then otherwise we long for the day of just the whiteboard or the overhead projector because it's more technical. More things can go wrong. There appear, Ian Mithra argues that there are more abnormal accidents that are happening nowadays. Delivered attacks on the news this morning, arrested several young gentlemen for a possible attack on the Washington, D.C. The transit system, more of that happening. The other two is the global warming. We're going to see more weather disasters. So we had several a couple of years ago with hurricanes. This week we've had some interesting weather patterns too in the Midwest. Well, not only more frequency, but greater consequences. I think back to the 2003 with the electrical outage in the Northeast. If you were trying to fly at that time, good luck. It impacted cross country. And even this week, if you were trying to fly with O'Hare being disrupted, your area may not have had a windstorm, but you may not have a plane to fly in. So there may be some people still trying to get to the conference. And I see ethical crisis management, too, as the ultimate test of ethical leadership, that it brings out the best or the worst of leaders when we get into a crisis situation. Because you're under threat, you've got to make decisions quickly, you've got the media looking at you the entire time. It's a tough situation to be in. And to successfully navigate a crisis, you have to draw on your ethical concepts and skills. You've got to make quick ethical decisions and so forth. Now, what surprised me was I wanted to write about this topic, and the material I'm sharing is coming out of a revision of my text called Meeting the Ethical Challenges of Leadership. I want to write a chapter about crisis management, but it was I found relatively, there's a ton of material on effective crisis management, get one spokesperson, get to the scene of the disaster, but not near as much on the ethical dimension of crisis management. So I tried to pull some things together, some out of communication, business ethics quarterly, and so forth, put my principles together, and then as I present them today, I'm going to be using the example of BP, which happened after I turned in my chapter, And my premise is going to be that this was an ethical disaster as well as an environmental disaster, the oil spill that happened in the spring and summer. So I'm going to begin by setting the stage and talking about what a crisis is, what I'm talking about, and the stages of a crisis, because my argument is that leaders have different ethical duties or responsibilities on each of these stages. So basically when I'm talking about a crisis situation, I'm talking about any major unanticipated event that poses a significant threat. And there's a lot embedded in that definition. It means we can't, we can do crisis management plans, but, we can't plan to have a crisis next Tuesday, or it's not really a crisis, they're unanticipated. And there's that notion of significant threat to individuals, to the organization, lives are at stake, and so forth. So that makes them hard from an ethical standpoint to deal with because there are high stress levels. There's limited time. We're not thinking as clearly. We don't have time to consult as many people. Various types of crises, you can find different topologies, but they range everything from natural disasters to terrorist attacks to foodborne illnesses to oil spills to mortgage crisis, and I would argue our major financial crisis was in large part an ethical crisis as well. But whatever type of crisis, they fall through three stages. And as I mentioned, each one there are certain ethical duties involved. The first is the pre-crisis. That's that period between crisis. So if you really want to be a pessimist, if you're not having a crisis, you will. You're just between. You've had one. Chances are that one is coming. But the leader's duty at this point is to fight against complacency and to be looking for potential danger signs. So one bad example here would be with the Challenger. Between the Challenger shuttle crash and the Columbia shuttle crash, immediately after Challenger, a lot of concern with safety, but by the time they got to Columbia, there was this assumption, we know how to send up shuttles. They didn't even have the last mission meeting on the ground before the astronauts came down. They were so confident. And when they landed, they were going to mention that, oh, by the way, there was a phone strike. It was no big deal. But then, of course, it was a tremendously big deal. So I would argue they didn't take their ethical responsibilities seriously enough. The crisis events where there's that trigger, there's a shooting, there's a bankruptcy, the leader then has the duty to recognize that a crisis has occurred, implement the crisis management plan, and limit the damage. Now, the first thing I mentioned seems fairly obvious. Oh, there's a crisis. Well, not always. Sometimes the leader's duty is to help the group recognize there's a crisis. So when it came to our financial crisis, there are still people who weren't convinced that we needed to bail out banks. In fact, that's been a lot of negative advertising going on right now in political campaigns against those who voted for entire funds. But that was a case where people weren't necessarily convinced that there was enough of a crisis to act. The post-crisis is the recovery stage. The ethical duty of the leader here is to restore the organization's image, to learn from the experience, to promote recovery and healing, specifically by determining who's to blame, what are the steps that we need to take. So that's in terms of background. Yeah. So the first principle is to assume broad responsibility. Yet this will be the foundation for the other principles that I mentioned. So I'd like to, in terms of quantitative research done by Brown and Trevino, looking at ethical leadership, the construct, and saying, if you're going to be an ethical leader, you have to be a moral person as well as a moral manager. So it begins with being accountable for your own actions. So a great many, sort of the base level for a lot of leaders is not to engage in unethical behavior that gets your organization in trouble. That rules out Bernie Madoff and Ken Lay and a lot of other people. So it starts here. We have a responsibility for ourselves, but we also have a responsibility for the group as a whole. What Brown and Trevino call the moral manager part. That it's our responsibility to get ethics on the radar screen, so to speak, for our employees, to set up the systems, the ethics officers, the reward systems, and so forth that encourage ethical behavior. Specifically, when it comes to a crisis situation, that might take the form of, as I mentioned earlier, identifying weaknesses, making sure you have a crisis management plan, mitigating harm, preventing a reoccurrence. I like to think in terms of breadth of responsibility and depth of responsibility in a crisis situation, because when you're in a crisis, all of a sudden you have a whole bunch more new stakeholders in an organizational setting. Because, if I'm living downstream from your release of toxic chemicals in my river, I'm now a stakeholder, and I wasn't before. The public and the media become stakeholders, so your breadth increases. But as well the depth, that you have to move beyond caring just for physical needs, but moving on to take care of people in broader ways. So I think, again, example of Marsh and McLennan, the professional service group, where they lost 295 employees in the towers, 9/11. But what they did was more than just here's money in terms of compensation. They assigned people to help each family, or work their way through the system. They put a memorial up, and so forth. So when it comes to BP, they didn't do such a great job. They overlooked safety issues. One engineer described the well that exploded as, this is a nightmare well, just days before. And BP just came out with their report, and Halliburton is taking issues, saying there are a lot of significant emissions and so forth. So second principle is to practice transparency. This one. That this begins as a moral duty in a democracy, that we want to know what our government is doing, we want to know what our publicly held corporations are doing, but it becomes even more important in a crisis situation. And when I'm talking about transparency, I'm talking about, first of all, openness, that we admit, that something went wrong, that we're open with information, we're not hiding information. Candor means we share the bad news as well as the good news. And then symmetry is probably more the ongoing relationship. And some of this comes out of public relations, which says that the best organizations have symmetrical relationships with outside groups. That is, they maintain good lines of communication and they listen as well as speak. That serves you well in a crisis situation, because you're going to hear, first of all, earlier about potential trouble spots, and you're probably going to get a much kinder audience if a crisis does occur. How does this specifically take shape when we talk about transparency in a crisis? That would be things, for example, like cooperating with the media, responding quickly to inquiries, providing detailed background information, being honest about what happened, releasing information as soon as it's available, and being more concerned about the needs of victims than in protecting organizational assets. BP did not do so well. If you remember, if you looked at that underground well shot, sure looked like a lot of oil coming out of that thing. They claimed 5,000, maybe 5,000 barrels a day. I think it came out, it was 62,000 barrels a day. And I ran across this quote in the New York Times. Howard Rubenstein works with the Yankees and his corporation. He said this was one of the worst PR approaches that I've ever seen in my 56 years of business. They tried to be opaque. They had every excuse in the book. Right away, they should have accepted responsibility and recognized what a disaster they faced. They basically thought they could spin their way out of catastrophe, but it doesn't work that way. Third principle is demonstrating care. So altruism, the need for altruism, I would argue, really ramps up in a crisis situation. So you've got to take responsibility for harming others as an organization and addressing the whole person. So what you don't want to do is what happened in the Challenger crash, where again we're glued to our TVs, seeing the shuttle blow up, and NASA is saying there was an apparent malfunction. It doesn't come across particularly well. So Addressing the whole person means, as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of anger typically, fear and so forth that's involved in these kinds of situations. We all experience that, I think, after 9/11, anger and fear, and dealing with that as well. This is where the ethics of care comes in from Gilligan and Mel Hoddings and so forth. Care for people and relationships. And the best example comes from 1984, the least example that I've run across. And in 1984, a gunman walked into a McDonald's in California, shot 40 people, killed 21. It wasn't McDonald's fault at all. So it would have been easy for McDonald's to say, it's not our fault. In fact, if we try to help, that could be seen as a sign of legal liability. But unusual lawyer, perhaps, lawyer stereotype. This guy was the general counsel of McDonald's at the time, and he said, let's not worry about lawsuits. Don't worry about it. We're going to do what's right. We're going to take care of families of victims. We'll worry about lawsuits later, and that's what they did. They canceled their McDonald's canceled their national ad campaign. They flew in family members. They paid their hospital bills. They eventually knocked the restaurant down and made a park out of that site. Now contrast that to Tony Hayward during the BP oil spill. A couple weeks into it said, I want my life back. Didn't sit real well because 11 people had died in the original explosion. So a little different approach there. But I don't want to park the mind somewhere and only say that it's compassion, compassion, compassion. We also need to engage a rationality. And there's two concepts that I ran across in doing research. One is the notion of mindfulness. I ran across that first on an interpersonal level. So if you're going to communicate effectively cross-culturally, you can't be on autopilot. You've got to really be paying attention to what's going on. Carl White and Catholic Sutcliffe argue that organizations also need to be mindful when it comes to at least preventing disasters, and they call them high reliability organizations. And then they use aircraft carrier decks as sort of the epitome of a high reliability organization. One of the most dangerous places you can be. Planes coming in, out, short space. It's slippery. The ship is probably bobbing up and down, and most of the sailors are young and new. So why don't we hear more about disasters on aircraft carriers? Well, they pay a lot of attention to close calls. They really look at those. They communicate constantly. And if you are low on the totem pole, so to speak, with your rank, then they will still listen to you. You can, in a sense, ignore rank if you have the expertise on the carrier. The other idea I ran across is this notion of ethical rationality, that certain organizations do a better job with gathering information on a regular basis. That serves them well when they come into a crisis situation, since they already deal well in gathering information, processing it. And these organizations tend to have a core ethic to begin with. A concern for society serves them well, and they make their decisions based on ethical principles. And my final principle here will demonstrate why this is so critical. BP didn't do quite so well on this. Had a poor safety culture ahead of time, and seemed to kind of lose its ethical way after the crisis occurred. And the fifth principle is to improvise from a strong moral foundation, because you don't really have a lot of time in a crisis situation. You have to be making decisions quickly. You can't plan for every contingency. But you also have to empower employees to take initiative. So a good example of this, and this principle comes out of some research that was done after 9/11. You take the Starbucks employees that were close to ground zero. They were rescuing people off the street. They were providing food and coffee and other drinks for people. Why? Because, number one, Starbucks has a good, solid ethical foundation. But secondly, they have the power to take that action in that situation. They were empowered to do that. And you had New York Times employees that were kayaking across a river to get to work and so forth, because they they felt it was important to keep the public up to date. The good news is that organizations can grow through this experience. A lot of 9/11 organizations that were impacted pretty heavily say that this, in the long term, bonded them as an organization, put them back into their ethical roots, so to speak, going forward. BP had, interesting enough, it's always interesting when you're reading after a company is in the news for the bad things. But BP had a good reputation. Of all the big oil companies, they were probably the best rep. So you're reading about the great things about BP, and you're thinking, wow, what happened? I think they didn't do well. Maybe they had a solid foundation, but they forgot about it and seemed to disappear at that time. So let me conclude saying a couple things. I think we're going to see more on crisis management, ethical crisis management. If you want to research in this area, I think there's lots of work to be done. I hope you will. And I think we have to play some ethical catch-up. It reminds me a little bit of medical ethics. We come up with these new medical techniques, and then we have to go back and figure out, well, should we use them or not? And that might be the case here. But I wanted to end with a nice example after picking on BP, and that's the Chilean mining disaster that we again witnessed worldwide. It's one of those things, the more I read about it, the better example it becomes. Sometimes you'll read or see something, and behind the scenes it's not so nice. It gets better the more you read. But they fulfilled all of these principles, assuming broad responsibility. The president of Chile said, he was advised basically, don't get involved with this rescue, because if it doesn't work, you're going to get blamed. He said, no, I'm going to go ahead, we'll spend whatever resources it takes, we're going to try to find these guys. Because there was no guarantee of finding these 33 miners who were buried for 2,000 feet underground, basically for 69 days. Transparency, probably an unprecedented level of transparency here in terms of briefings. They filmed the guys coming out. That was a little iffy, because what if the capsule got stuck? There we've all been watching. They were honest with the miners. The mining director was told, don't give all the information to the guys below. He said, no, I'm going to talk to them regularly. I'm going to tell them exactly what's going on, and they really appreciated that. Demonstration of care. Again, the Chilean president said, we're going to look for these guys as if they're our sons. And when it got down to, more and more time, because it took them 17 days to find out they were alive, even when it was below 2% chance they'd find them, he said, we're still going to keep looking. Engaged the head as well as the heart. They weren't too proud. They were humble enough to ask NASA for help. How do we treat the guys once we find them and so forth? How should we design the capsule? They had 3 different shafts going on, different mining techniques to get to the guys. And then the last one is more for the guys that were underground. Immediately they organized themselves into different teams. They only had a couple cans of tuna, and they decided that they were going to share that tuna together, and if they were going to die, they were going to die together, and they were going to die with dignity. So they were able to work improvise from a strong moral foundation. So later on, I look forward to your comments and questions, and I'll turn it over to Terry. We'll take just a second to get between machines here.
Take a quick question or comment while I'm doing this.
Okay, yeah. Are there any initial comments or questions? Yes.
It's occurred to me as you've been talking, one of the aspects here with this disaster that you mentioned in particular is, as we have more multinational corporations and more subcontractors and things like that, even the mining things in America, you've got your organizational ethos, but as you have more and more subcontractors, more and more, we're operating in a different world. How do you get that ethos down? Because your corporate and your core may have it, but your subcontractors may not. I know the military space after the Blackwater Security Force, they do something wrong. How come your subcontractor screwed up? Well, there are subcontractors. How do you? So that's not a blessing.
I think you have to assume broad responsibility. I think you have to assume responsibility with the subcontractor. I mean, Nike finally did that, where they were under attack. They said, first, we wash our hands of this as their subcontractors, and then they went, 180 degrees the other direction, and said, okay, we have to be responsible. So then, from a practical sense, I don't know your subcontractors, I know you. if you're the face, you piece the face of this. And that would be my initial response. But you're right, it may not have actually been them, it would have been a subcontractor. But as far as the public is concerned, you're the face of this thing.
We test Brandon to work the first
That's
time.
right.
So you want this one
Other questions?
Yes.
You said there wasn't much research done in this particular
I
area.
didn't, I mean, I couldn't find a book. I just kind of, looked at ethical leadership. There were a number of articles in Business Ethics Quarterly, so you might look in there.
Can I get back on my screen?
A lot of work has been done in communication for the basic steps. And there's a Crisis Management Institute out of Southern California.
Great, thank you very much.
They don't talk as much about the ethical part of it,
Go
but
ahead.
it's a good place to sort of get grounded. So let me make one thing clear. There's a lot of research being done on crisis management. It's a booming area. It's just, I was a little surprised that when I specifically wanted to look at the ethical part of it, a little like, oh, maybe I didn't look in the right spot, but I can't refer you to a book on ethical crisis management, an entire book. So, that's it. Maybe one of you will put together an edited body on that, or a research project, yeah. All right, I'll turn it over to Terry.
Good morning. As Craig said, I'm Terry Price from the Jefferson School of Leadership Studies. I'm going to talk about followership ethics and autonomy. I'll warn you, I'm a philosopher by training, so a lot of what I do is fairly conceptual, and I think the job of philosophers is to go in and kind of clear weeds sometimes, think about meanings of words and what's special about certain concepts. I think there's something distinctive about followership and the ethical challenges of followership. I'm going to try to get at some of that today. So I have two objectives. One is to do something about the analysis of the concept of followership and point out that I think there's a moral tension in that concept, that kind of intrinsic to the notion. And the second thing I'm going to try to do is talk about autonomy in a way that helps us get rid of that tension without doing away with followership altogether. I'm going to suggest that some people in literature are inclined to kind of move away from followership because of this tension and leave it alone. I'm going to try to hit it head on if I can. If you read the followership literature, and there's more and more of it, and it's really quite good, most all the work starts with talk about the neglect of followership, which is getting harder and harder to do, I think, because there's less and less neglect of followership. And one explanation is leader-centric thinking, that you focus on the leader all the time and not on followers. There may be something to that, but I would say for the last 100 years, people have tried to move away from this great man view of leadership and thinking about the role of followers in the process. And so I'm not real convinced by that argument. As you know, if you've looked at the two main approaches to leadership, transformational leadership and transactional leadership, both focus very heavily on the role of followers. Transformational leadership on raising followers to higher levels of motivation and morality, and transactional leadership as a relationship exchange between leaders and followers. So I don't think there's been a whole lot of neglect there. There's also an economic explanation, and Barbara Kellerman makes this point, that there isn't a whole lot of money in followership. There's more money in leadership. And so if you're going to write a book, you ought to write on leadership. Or if you write a book on followership, you need to put leadership in the title somewhere, at least, because you want to sell books. There may be something to that one as well. I think, I'm not sure it's so much neglect as I think you're ambivalent about followership, and I think it's because of a moral issue associated with it, and we're not sure quite what to do with it. And so we try to address it, and then we end up setting aside, or as I'll suggest later, redefining things to avoid the problem. Here's the conceptual part. I think what makes followership distinctive, morally distinctive, is that it resides in this kind of special place that we're not comfortable with, and that's between freedom on the one hand and coercion on the other. Coercion, of course, is being made to behave in some way. Freedom is, this is a rough characterization, of course, but being let to do what you want to do, to be completely free. And I think followership is really in the middle. That's the only special effect I have. And my 12-year-old daughter did that. She doesn't know how to do it. But, it took her 2 seconds.
Do it again.
I can go back. If things get rough, we'll come back to the slide. Okay, so followership, I think it's in the middle. And I think it's being got to do something. It's getting people to do something and being on the leadership side and being got to do something on the other side. And so it's right in between the two. Coercion we find problematic morally, and for good reason. Actions like physically forcing someone to do something, throwing a chain around their neck and making them do it, putting a gun to their head, or drugging them, or hypnotizing them if that works, or even deceiving them. We see those as coercive behaviors, and we think there's something wrong with it. I'm a big fan of Immanuel Kant, who was an 18th century German philosopher, and he said, what all these things have in common is you're bypassing the rationality of people. You're going around their reason to make them do things. So deceiving someone is just another form. I mean, we think physical coercion is worse, perhaps, but it's the same kind of thing when you deceive somebody. You're making them do something about bypassing their rationality. So we find coercion problematic, and we try to avoid it. I don't think it characterizes the leader-follower relation. It's not a relationship of making. And if it moves too far into that direction of making, of course, some leadership will kind of play around with making, with threats and other things. But if it moves too far in the direction of coercion, I think we don't even talk about it as being leadership. We talk about it as being something else. For example, a master-slave relation, I don't think is a leadership relation. It's a relation of complete coercion. Okay, so that's on one side, coercion. On the other side, being let to behave. Each person has a choice to do what he or she wants to do. They're the source of decision-making authority. Another advocate of autonomy, Kant, I mentioned earlier, was a big advocate of autonomy. That's why I'm focusing on these thinkers. John Stuart Mill is, if you read On Liberty, is very much in favor of this kind of letting people do what they want to do, in large part to develop their individuality. He's utilitarian. He thinks if you let people develop their individuality, then they are happier themselves and they're better able to help us. So he argues for things such as experiments in living. You shouldn't do what other people are doing, but go out and make your own way. Find what's best for you. He says the world's not going to fit you. It's just like one set of clothes doesn't fit all of us. You have to find what fits you in your life, and that's the way life is. So in a way, he's advocating leadership. He has an argument about genius being the way to get. If you have this context of freedom, then genius can be exercised. I don't think that really characterizes followership either. It's too independent in a way. Too much independence and freedom from this other kind of relationship. So what's followership then? I think what makes it morally tricky is that it's voluntary choice that calls behavior. It's voluntary like the freedom or independent part, and it's cause behavior like the coercive part. And that's the morally troubling aspect of followership. Joel Feinberg wrote about causing voluntary action and providing motives for action. He wrote about mainly in the context of entrapment, because entrapment, the law provides a special kind of problem. You get someone to do something they would like to do, or if you go out and a police officer dressed as a prostitute, and then in a way you're causing someone to do something they argue is voluntary. That's the context Joel Feinberg was writing in. I think it applies just as well to thinking about leadership. And he said in these cases you provide people with motives for acting. So if you think about transactional leadership, to get someone to do something, to get someone to do something that you want them to do, you offer them something perhaps, or help them avoid some cost that they would like to avoid, and therefore you provide them with a motive for acting. They didn't want to do the action in the first place, but now they're willing to do the action because what they might get or what they can avoid by doing that action. And then transformational leadership, Burns and others write about getting people to act on higher motives, getting back to the common good, or as opposed to self-interest. There's a sense in which you're providing leaders are providing motives for action and getting people to act. Okay. In the literature, and I can't, of course, go through all the literature, and I'll focus on a couple of pieces of it. I think people typically run into this tension, this conflict, this built into followership, and tend to try to move away from it. And one way they do it is by defining it away, by trying to redefine things. If you've read Ross, from very early stages in his work, he said there's no such thing as followership, it's all leadership. And there are followers, but then even later in Jean Blumen's collection, he says, people have convinced me that we should get rid of the word followers too and call them collaborators or something. So there's a lot of talk. Can we just move away, just get rid of followers and followership and talk about leadership and give them different names. So that's one strategy. Barbara Kellerman in her recent work is more willing, I think, to embrace the words follower and followership. But I think she still does something with definitions to avoid it and to avoid the problem. So what she does is define followers and by their rank and not by their behavior. I'm going to read to you just a little bit from the piece I'm working on to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. She says, followers are subordinates who have less power, authority, and influence than do their superiors, end quote. They do not necessarily, quote, go along with what someone else wants and intends, end quote. Okay, now this is me. By defining followers in terms of their position and so avoiding a behavioral characterization of what it is to be a follower, Kellerman makes it much easier to get around the charge there's something morally problematic about followership. In short, having one's behavior subjected to another's will, that's being got to do something, is not a defining feature of being a follower. In fact, based on Kellerman's examples throughout the book, which is a very good book I recommend to you, we might conclude that conformity to the will of leaders is best avoided because it's precisely what makes one a bad follower. In politics, bad followers include individuals who supported or did nothing to stop bad leaders, such as Adolf Hitler, Pol Pot, Saddam Hussein, Kim Jong-il, or D.C. Mayor Marion Barry. In religious cults, they're the followers of Jim Jones, David Koresh. In the business and nonprofit world, bad followers are members of a leader's inner circle or board of directors. What then characterizes a good follower and good followership? Kellerman answers the question this way. Environmentalists, is a quote, environmentalists, for example, and shareholder activists and whistleblowers are generally considered admirable for taking the time and trouble, and in some cases, the risk to speak truth to power and right or wrong. People like these may be said then to exemplify good followership. Excuse me, they refuse to permit their lack of relative power, authority, or influence to preclude them from doing something they think should be done, end quote. The kind of followers that get top billing in Kellerman's work include faculty members who stood up to Harvard President Larry Summers, Israeli Air Force pilots who refused to carry out attacks that risked the lives of innocent Palestinians, student protesters, NBC employees who pushed for the firing of disc jockey Don Imus, citizens who organized an effort to stop an immigration bill, doctors who spoke out against drug companies, on and on with examples. And the point here is the way I think she gets around this tension is to say, let's not think about followers in terms of their behavior, what they're actually doing. Let's talk about followers in terms of their rank. And then they can behave in some other way. And we don't have to deal with the fact that they're being got to do things because, of course, these people aren't being got to do things. They're behaving in oppositional ways, and in most cases opposing leaders. Okay, I'll stop with that. Does that point make sense? Okay. Okay, now let me try to address the tension just a bit by saying, should we give up on the idea that there can be something at least morally permissible and maybe morally admirable about following in the sense of being got to do things? Or is it something we really ought to just do away with, either by redefining what followership is or something else? So I'm going to take us back to Kant just for a minute. You might think in Kant's work that there is something problematic about following. And I have here Kant's second version of the categorical imperative, which basically says when you act toward other people, you ought not to use them. You should always treat them as an end in themselves and never merely as a means. And Kant thinks that's true when you're when you're acting toward other people. He also thinks it's true when you're acting toward yourself, that you can use yourself in a way. You can treat yourself as a means. So it's not sufficient that you consent to something for Kant, that you can wrong yourself, and that's kind of distinctive or unique to this moral theory. It might also apply, or I think it probably also does apply, to what one lets others do to you. So there could be something morally problematic about followership if you're letting leaders get you to do things, right? In a way, you're letting yourself be used. It's wrong to use other people. It's wrong to use yourself. And it's wrong, according to Kant, I think, to let yourself be used by other people. So there's something potentially problematic on a Kantian account about followership, or it could be. Kant, though, has, and people don't focus nearly as much on his political philosophy, and I've started to do more work with it. Kant was also, on the one hand, potential problems with followership and autonomy. On the other hand, Kant was a big fan of obedience and political obedience. And I have just a couple of quotes here. He's been criticized mightily for this, but he says basically the prohibition on resistance and disobedience is unconditional. He's talking about the state context, that you can't rebel. And people say, well, how does all this fit together with what he says about autonomy more generally? Kant thought this is a principal reason. Here he's talking about the state context, that we all want to live together, and we all want to live together in harmony. And the only way to do that, it sounds a little Hobbesian. It wasn't a Hobbesian, but it sounds a little Hobbesian. The only way to do it is to have authority, right? And so whatever your ends are, you want to live in a society where you can get things done, and to make that work, you have to have authority, and we have to obey it. And so that was the argument. So there is this tension then in Kant's view between autonomy on the one hand and this view of obedience. Now, of course, the obedience side fits much better with followership. And what I'm going to try to do, how much time do I have left? 5 minutes. What I'll try to do in the next couple of minutes is to fit the two back together, the autonomy part and the obedience part, and hope that that gives us some way to think about followership that allows for what I would say is genuine or real followership. Kant does say, and this is kind of hard to find in the reams and reams of Kant, he does say at one point, and I think it's important, that you should obey the authority that has power over you in whatever does not conflict with inner morality. So there's a limit. There's a limit in things on what you can willingly do or morally do, justifiably do, that you've been asked to do, even in this state context, which is so important for him. So what I want to do then is ask whether we might think about inner morality as a limitation a more general limitation on followership, what followers can be expected to do. And then the more important point is, could it be the source for thinking about general duties of followership so we could get a strong or more robust sense of what followership or good followership is. This is Kant's first version of the categorical imperative. It says act only on that maxim, but you can at the same time will it to become universal law. So Kant's morality generally says when you're deciding whether or not to do an action, you ought to try to universalize that action. Imagine a world in which everyone does it. If not everyone can do that action, then reason tells you that you're not justified in doing it either. It's a little bit like the golden rule. I think slightly different. I'm not going to go into why it's different. But think about lying, for example. A good example for Kant. When you tell a lie, the only way to make it work is for other people to tell the truth most of the time. If everyone's a liar, lying does no good. Lying depends upon a backdrop of truth-telling. So for you to lie, you have to make an exception of yourself. Kant says that's unreasonable. That's what makes it wrong. Driving in the emergency lane. What if everyone drives in the emergency lane? Well, it will become a lane just like all the others. It only works for you. You can only drive 60 miles an hour in the emergency lane while everyone else is sitting stopped in traffic if you're the one doing it, and not everyone else is doing it. If everyone else does it, it becomes a lane like all the others. It's unreasonable. So there are lots of examples, breaking promises, whatever else. So from this version of the categorical imperative, you get a prohibition on all kinds of behaviors that, the things that can't be universalized, promise breaking, lying, those sorts of things. So it would apply to any action done, I think, individually or done in concert with others at the direction of somebody else. So if leaders ask you to do things or order you to do things that are in violation of what Kant was talking about as inner morality, then you have an obligation not to do it. It's that simple. So there's a limitation, a moral limitation on what you can be asked to do individually with others or under the direction of somebody else. So you get a fairly strong limit, I think, on what you can do as a follower. However, this leaves room for all kinds of behavior. There are all kinds of things that can be universalized, right? Lying, promise breaking cannot be, and other things cannot be universalized, but there are all kinds of other things that you might be asked to do, we might be asked to do, directed to do, that would be permissible for us to do, and no violation of respect for the autonomy of the follower. So it looks like you can buy, what I'm suggesting is you can buy into an account of autonomy, see the value of autonomy the way Kant does, and still leave room for followership, for following where it's not problematic. Last main point, I think not only does it allow followership, so there's nothing all that problematic with it as long as you're not behaving immorally, but it's also the foundation for thinking about duties of followers, which is the positive side. Keeping promises. If you promise to do something as a follower, then I think you have a duty to do it, and that's based squarely in Kant's ethics. Doing one's job versus free riding. Free riding is a perfect example of exception making. If you're free riding on the work of other people, you're making an exception of yourself. If everyone were to free ride, then the job wouldn't get done. So you could probably generate some duty, I think, about carrying out one's responsibilities in one's position. Being loyal. Kant doesn't talk a whole lot about loyalty. Virtue ethics, ethicists are much more likely to talk about loyalty. But if you think about expectations we have of each other in relationships, your spouse, it could be thought of purely contractually. You could say, why shouldn't I have an affair? Or why should I? Well, I made a promise, and there's a contract there. And Kant often talks about promise and contract. Another reason would be you want to be loyal to your spouse. And why? Because you expect your spouse to be loyal to you. There's a sense in which if you have an expectation that others behave in a certain way, that same expectation should apply to you. So I think you might be able to generate duties of loyalty out of a Kantian account. Even obedience. If you're expecting other people in your organization to obey when obedience is necessary, and there may be situations where strict obedience is necessary, then by willing that, I think on a Kantian account, you're also applying that general principle to yourself. Now, all these things, I put moral on the obedience part because when people see obeying orders, you get really scared, right? You see argument obey orders. Now, I put the moral. All these would say you keep promises. When you've made a promise that if I promise to kill someone else, that's not a justifiable promise. So these are promises that are morally made or for actions that can be morally done. And the same thing for doing one's job, being loyal. You shouldn't be loyal to Hitler, right? So there are limitations on all these. But once you've met met the conditions or the limitations, then I think there's nothing morally problematic about doing it. And in fact, you may have a duty to do it. Okay. My conclusion then is that if you have an acceptable account of what autonomy is, and I think the Kantian account is a fairly good one, or one that I'm attracted to, you don't have to privilege oppositional behaviors in the way that I think a lot of the followership literature does, and maybe for good reason, because we see cases where people need to oppose and they don't. But that's just one side of being a good follower, and I think that's maybe even a small side. And we're not, most of us don't have to oppose. Maybe that's too strong. Gene may tell me that's way too strong. But in our jobs, don't have to oppose bad leaders every day. You have to oppose bad leaders whether if you're in that situation, or if you're being asked to do something immoral, or they're doing something immoral. But another part of leadership will be recognizing, another part of autonomy will be recognizing what it allows and, in fact, what it requires, I think, more positive followership behaviors that are consistent with autonomy, maybe even logically required by it. Okay. Thank you very much.
My co-teaching partner in crime, Bob, we co-teach an ethics course. He's heard this before, so if you'll excuse him for departing to do something more useful at this time. I have no PowerPoint slides, and with your permission, I'd like to just sit here and chat informally with you about the notion of administrative evil and its intersection with leadership and ethics. But before I get too far into this discussion, I'd like to know, for my own benefit, how many of you have a working knowledge of what this concept of administrative evil is all about? Those of you familiar with administrative evil, would you raise your hands, please?
Same thing as workplace bullying, mobbing, instability, that kind of stuff.
Well, I am in the right place. This is good, because there were about 2 people, I think, that raised hands in addition to my distinguished men.
Knowledge doesn't seem to be extra credit.
Okay, any knowledge. Any knowledge of the work of Adams and Balfour's unmasking administrative evil. No? Okay, great. Then my mission here is to introduce to you a concept that I think is quite useful when we talk about the intersection of leadership and ethics.
and I will both introduce it and later on I will provide a critique, at least some critique, because I think although it is a useful concept, it is also a flawed concept, as many concepts are. And I will also suggest an agenda for scholarship on the topic that I hope some of you in the room might consider taking up. I do have a paper to go with this that I have about 25 copies up here, but I also have some business cards, so if you're interested and you cannot take a paper copy away from this conference today, feel free to drop me an email and I'll be happy to send you the electrons. I have no idea where this essay will end up. I did not write it with a particular destination or publication in mind, so if anybody has any good ideas about that, I'd love to hear about that as well. Okay. Administrative evil. First of all, administrative evil is not an ethical theory in the sense that it provides us with a process for making morally supportable decisions. It's really a concept that recognizes that the production of evil might well be not only a possibility, but a probability of otherwise well-intentioned people in the modern contemporary organization. In other words, the production of evil may be an artifact of modernity and the way we have organized ourselves in the modern world. So that's at least one of their major theses. And I believe that the implications of that for leadership and good leadership and effective leadership can be quite profound and is worthy of at least some consideration. The concept came to us, it's one of the relatively new concepts in ethics. It came to us in 1998 through the publication of Guy Adams and Danny Balfour's book, Unmasking Administrative Evil. And I must confess to you, this is the third edition of their book now, so they're making rather constant revisions in their approach. But I have to confess to you that when I first ran across this book, I was walking through the university bookstore and I saw it on the shelf. And I said, Unmasking Administrative Evil. That's great. Oh, I have to read this book because I hate administration. I hate paperwork. I hate bureaucracy and red tape. Oh, I'm just going to really enjoy this book. It's nothing about that. It's about something much more profound, I think, and much more provocative. Again, the modernity argument, as I mentioned. Charles Perrault, in the foreword of the first edition of Unmasking Administrative Evil, he asserted that while the concept does require more work, the authors, Adam and Balfour, have made a beginning. No other book in mainstream organizational theory has even noticed the problem of administrative evil. He admired both their courage and their analysis, and I have to also confess to you that I'm not entirely objective on this concept. I have a personal stake in it. Guy Adams is a friend of mine from the University of Missouri. I consider him a friend, and I have co-authored with Adams and Balfour, and one of the chapters in their book is a co-authored piece that I participated in, the analysis, the use of administrative evil to conduct an analysis of the prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib Central Prison. So I'm invested in this. So please keep that in mind as I also level a critique. Administrative evil is one of the reasons I suggest that perhaps there's not widespread knowledge of the concept. It is a concept that comes from the field of public administration, okay, which has its own context and its own barriers to entry, just like any other field or discipline. And it stemmed, at least initially, from their study of the Nazi Holocaust. They wanted to understand the role of the German civil service and the corporate sector in facilitating crimes against humanity. Now, such levels of destruction, such organized levels of destruction could not have taken place without the help of an efficiently operating civil service. Many of the public servants, however, had a very limited connection to the downstream effects of their labor. Some knew, and when we know about evil, that's abject evil, not administrative evil, which is a different concept. Some suspected, perhaps, but remained compliant, and others were oblivious. But nonetheless, their activities were essential in perpetrating the evil. In their book, they also include less obvious cases, such as Operation Paperclip, the spiriting away of Nazi scientists to the United States to participate in the American rocket program, and therefore the avoidance of justice. And perhaps their most nebulous connection are the Challenger and Columbia disasters that Dr. Johnson's already mentioned. We've also seen it to apply, as I said, to Abu Ghraib Central Prison, which was the work that I'm most familiar with. So what they're arguing, some of their argument here is that in the modern age, specifically, there is a technical, rational mindset, technical, rational, scientific mindset perhaps, with its emphasis on analysis and the progress of science and the belief that we're at some sort of pinnacle of progress, has served to dim our collective moral imaginations and also, therefore, our sensitivity to evil. As a result, well-intentioned people participate in systems and processes that produce great harm as downstream effects. Now, these people don't intend great harm. There's no intentionality associated with it. And most would agree at the time that they are simply acting in consonance with accepted professional practice. I'll give you some examples in a minute. And this relates to the responsibility that Dr. Johnson mentioned earlier for the individual's responsibility for the whole. But Adams and Balfour are arguing that because of the functions of our modern organizations, and perhaps even our emphasis on compliance that is fairly ingrained into our system, we have diminished this individual responsibility for the whole. So I admittedly had some difficulty with this notion early on in seeing the connection between the rational technical mindset and evil. After all, I come from the field of public policy. And the field of public policy has had at its heart, since its inception, what I call the rationality project. The idea that we need to bring more rationality, more science, more analysis to the messy field of politics to have better policy decisions. That's a project that I buy into. I participate in, and I believe it. And here comes Adams and Balfour suggesting that that's part of the problem. I had some issue with that, as have other people in the field of public policy and public administration, I might add. So it was not until I thought about the organizational implications of modernity and this mindset that I was actually able to get their point. So try this on. By organizational consequences, what I'm really talking about here is the role of differentiation, maybe even excessive specialization, and the diffusion of work that exists, and it is probably characteristic of the modern organization. So when members of the organization, insert school, company, government agency, however you want to parse it, are far removed from the collective impact and downstream effects through institutional norms that are enforced by psychological and social cues, they learn to avoid difficult questions. They learn to remove their individual responsibility for the collective and just do their job or watch their lane. And all of the other euphemisms that go with, don't worry about it, just do your part. Be a cog in the system. Stay in your box. Thank you very much. Because responsibility and accountability are so diffused, bad things indeed happen to good people. And good people participate in organizations that do bad things. Okay. I think that's useful. And I think that's interesting, and it's something that we can all probably ponder and do something effective with. So in the paper, I sought to explore some of the key concepts of administrative evil and suggest some implications for practice. And I won't go into any more details because the paper provides some of those concepts. But let me just say that to find administrative evil, it's important to note that we need to look beyond the organizers of the evil and those who engage in intentional acts, such as the Hitlers and the Eichmanns and the Madoffs. Instead, think about the driver of the bus, okay, who dutifully transports people to and from the central city holding area to the train station. Now, he intends no great harm to anyone. He may pride himself in his upkeep of the bus, his many years of prompt and efficient service, and the fact that he's always on time. He's just doing his job and doing it well. But if later we know that he's transporting Jews and political prisoners to a concentration camp, to a train that's taking those people to a concentration camp, now his activities appear morally questionable. That is a characteristic, a primary characteristic of administrative evil. Thus we see the importance of unmasking evil, the importance of the transparency that others have mentioned. So when evil bursts on the consciousness of the public, our moral sensibilities are then activated, and what appeared to be just in the practice becomes morally questionable in the rearview mirror. Now, the example I like to use for that is at Abu Ghraib, the instance for which I worked pretty hard on this. And at Abu Ghraib, there were certainly people on Tier 1 who were responsible, who engaged in prisoner abuse willingly and with full knowledge. But how do we assess the medics? How do we assess the health service professionals who treated individuals that had characteristic injuries that were indicative of abuse? And what did they do? They treated those injuries very effectively. They annotated those injuries in medical records. There's nothing morally questionable about that activity. But when we know that there was abuse and the extent of the abuse that took place, now we look back at those medical people and we say, well, did they meet all of the morally responsible obligations merely in treating and annotating in records? I mean, that's what they're supposed to do. So that's where administrative evil lives. So another way, how do we think about administrative assistants and tobacco companies that have no power over the decisions of the executives, yet they are crucial to corporate operations? So my sense is that there are two discussions that in play in this area that have relatively little connection to each other. On one hand, we have the ethicists who focus on individual moral development, and this is a project that goes back to the ancient Greek project of defining the excellent person, Aristotle and Plato and the like. To know the good is to want to be good. Unethical behavior is the result of ignorance of the good or character flaws. Now, social psychologists, on the other hand, like Philip Zimbardo and the like, they suggest another alternative. They say it's the barrel that makes the individual go bad. It's the psychological and social cues, the situational imperatives that drive human behavior truly. So good people go bad. And we see that, of course, with the Stanford Prison Experiment, the Milgram experiments, and all the others that are famous. Now, the bridge between the two, in part, is administrative evil. I think it's one of its useful aspects. Now, let me skip forward at this point to the critique, if you will. Administrative evil is something that appears to be rather easy to find in retrospect. But in order to be really useful for leadership and leadership practice, we need to find ways to discover administrative evil as it's occurring. As it's occurring, not just in the rearview mirror. Otherwise, it's interesting, but it's not particularly useful. It's easy to find administrative evil in almost any human catastrophe. And Adams and Balfour, as a matter of fact, I gave them, I love working with them, but I gave them the long arm when they asked me to work with them to apply administrative evil to Hurricane Katrina response. And my response was, of course. I don't think we have anything necessarily new to contribute to looking at these continued disasters. It's always there, which says something about the prevalence of administrative evil, if they are correct. But it also says, why can't we find it when it's happening? I mean, Irving Janis did that for us with groupthink, right? He said, not only is there this phenomenon called groupthink, but here's its precursors, here's what you can look for, and here's how to avoid it. That work has yet to be done, and I hope someone in this room will take that up. I'm waiting for the case for administrative evil in the Gulf League, in the Gulf of Mexico.
Sure it's there.
Yeah, I'm sure it's there, absolutely. There is currently no existing measure or scale to assess administrative evil, and perhaps some of the components of existing ethical climate surveys augmented with questions specific to the concept would be useful. Determining that organization is susceptible and then providing those tools to increase moral sensitivity and aid in the unmasking process, I think would be work that would be beneficial. And we do need additional experimentation to identify situations where individuals are more or less likely to participate in administrative evil. The extent to which culture plays a role or the impact of various personality factors that are involved might be useful. And I see great promise in the work of experimental ethics that further bridges this psychology and moral philosophy, the situational imperative versus individual character approach. So if administrative evil is as commonplace as Adams and Balfour suggest, then those of us who study and practice leadership have our work cut out for us. If we accept that the complex organizational structures of contemporary life are more likely than not to produce systems that harm people, then we have an obligation to look for that harm and in their turn unmask it. And then having unmasked the evil, responsible moral agents are then in a position to evaluate their continued support of the system. In some cases, they'll be obligated to not only refrain from participation, but to actively work to counter the evil. The disobedience of followership perhaps applies here. So to that end, I recommend additional effort within the Academy to include interdisciplinary research that takes this rather useful concept out of public administration into a larger sphere. I encourage your efforts there, and if my essay and exploration incites any additional research or effort and dialogue on this topic, then I will be pleased indeed.
We have about 10 minutes for questions, and to be fair, since you already had a chance to ask me some questions, I prefer we focus on our last two presenters. A couple questions here.
Yeah. I can't. Leo can't. So it makes perfect sense that I have a question.
This is the outcut. This is what we all fear. That you're talking about something, and someone's I am kind.
I was really impressed with you for a second. I'm real interested.
Well, I'm a psychologist, and I do research on destructive leadership behavior. Incidentally, a laboratory, if you will, of testing offshore installation managers on the Norwegian continental shelf in the role of crisis manager. So we actually were in the middle of playing what actually happened live here with Deepwater Horizon. So that's kind of the context I do my research. And we're focusing on behavior. We use two parameters basically, one about being anti-subordinate, behaving anti-subordinate, and one anti-organizational interest, what is legitimate interest. Now I've finished my data gathering, and now I can't dodge the bullet anymore. I have to address the categorical imperative. And one of my dilemmas there is that this is something that happens in your head, right? You make a judgment whether this is a breach of a maxim that could relate to universal law, whereas I observe behavior. So my question to you is, do you have any suggestions on how to conduct empirical studies and to get to grips with a categorical imperative, or to infer from behavioral observations whether there has been a breach of the categorical imperative?
So one thing that's interesting about leadership studies generally is it's a combination of empiricists and people in the humanities. And ethics, if you're an ethicist, doesn't rely on empirical facts. So there isn't anything to look at, I think, to see if something's good or bad. And you're right that Kant thinks you can do it using reason. And the examples I gave, like lying, I'd have to point to any research. I said, think about it. For you to tell a lie, you have to make an exception. Oh, that's right. Yeah, that makes sense to me. That's reasonable or unreasonable of me to try to do that thing. So I think ethics, you can do all kinds of studies, what people think about ethics. You can define what ethical behavior is, see if they do it or not. But getting at ethics itself through empirical means, I think, is not going to work. That said, I think you can look at psychological features of people to think about what they're able to do and what they're likely to do. I've been working on empirical things with Crystal Hoyt, who's a psychologist, and looking at the way people think about themselves. And I'm inclined, as part of I'm inclined to think that people from the psychological research I've looked at think about themselves as being exceptional. And we've done research about there's a well-established phenomenon of thinking you're better than average, right? Everyone is better looking than average and smarter than average. And if we did, I could pass out cards now, and people would be usually in the top half. But we can't all be in the top half.
Do we have to tell them, though?
Do have to tell them. Okay, let's set that aside. So what Crystal Hoyt and I have looked at is the way people overestimate the importance of their ends, of what they're doing. And the phenomenon applies just as well there, that people think that their own goals and projects are more important than other people, and that's what justifies breaking rules that they would accept apply. So I guess I think for most people, it's no secret that you shouldn't lie and deceive and break promises, unless you're raised by wolves. You probably know that. The tricky part's the psychological part, which is that even though people know that, they're willing to behave differently. Why? And there's a psychological explanation, because they think what they're doing is more important than what other people are doing.
And because the systems and processes that are in place, the psychological and social cues, drive you to that behavior regardless of your individual character or level of moral development. Boy, that's discomforting. You see why these two conversations don't necessarily gel really well? It's not about the individual. It's not about your character. It's about the situational imperative will drive you, a good person, to do bad. It will. That's the assertion of the psychologist.
Yeah, Lucifer effect. We had a, you want to follow up? But we had a quick hand up earlier, and we'll try to get a couple more in.
Just a question for Terry also. I think the duty of loyalty from scholarship is problematic. Because it seems like it's a slippery slope to obey orders that are immoral. And the example that you gave was an example of people in a marriage.
Mm-hmm.
So could you comment more on how you see that playing out in an organization?
Yeah, well, I guess this, I mean, if you're saying, are you saying empirically if you have those attitudes of loyalty, then you'll wind up obeying when you shouldn't obey?
Yeah, or
Possibly.
Or why do you have loyalty as a duty of followers?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think followers expect leaders to be loyal to them in some way, and you expect other people in the organization to be loyal to the organization and loyal perhaps to the leader. And you know, you can imagine, we probably all lived through cases where people in the organization have been disloyal to a leader, and you feel bad about that, and it's like a wrong was done. So I guess in terms of a relationship with other people, I think loyalty is generally a good thing. Now, you're right, it has to stop at the point where, just like when your spouse tells you, I'm going to go kill the guy next door, can you help me out? It has to stop somewhere. You have to draw a line. And there could be some psychological reason to say we shouldn't think about the relationship in that way, because once you start thinking about it that way, you wind up, you're in a system and you're psychologically disposed to go farther. And so maybe it's dangerous to think about it that way. I'm open to that.
Well, and I would think right now we're all being loyal to organizations by being in session and not touring bus. But I mean, I think in a very practical sense, being loyal to the people who pay you and provide health benefits and so forth. To me, that's a basic level. A question in the back, and then we'll finish with two more. So we'll have to make short answers because we'll get down.
Thank you for sharing your topics. One of the things that seemed to come up over a little bit was the issue of transparency, especially trans crisis or in other parts. And one of the questions I had is that today we continue to see an expanded role that the media plays in crisis and other things. And do you think that a natural tension now exists between being properly transparent during a crisis and between those who are in positions of leadership and are being asked to respond to that?
Well, I think in a crisis, there's particularly more of that tension between, what do you reveal and legally what are you obligated to be. It'll be interesting to track it. I'm doing a case on WikiLeaks right now, and wow, it may be wide open before it's done, that everything's going to be done, but that may endanger lives and so forth. So if I understand you correctly, I do think there's a growing more and more of attention, because certain things as leaders you have to keep quiet.
Well, and I think in terms of Adams and Balfour's suggestion that unmasking is a good thing, obviously the instantaneous communication age and the interconnectivity of the World Wide Web and so forth provides many opportunities for unmasking that would be beneficial in reducing administrative evil.
I think Joanna had her hand up, and then we'll...
I have two quick questions, one about Aristotle and one about Kant. On Aristotle, George, Aristotle is marvelous for talking about administrative ethics because he bridges the gap between the individual and the group. It's the virtues.
Responsibility to society.
Yes, but I think that gap is not particularly big in those virtue ethics if it's done right. Do it that way. Terry, a couple of questions.
You have to ask Mr. Kant if you have a Kant question.
I was surprised you didn't move into thinking about the kingdom events in terms of the followers. And I was wondering if you were going to make that move. So that's one question. And the other question I had was about how you construct the Kantian autonomy of the will. If you look at the autonomy of the will as Kant talks about it, and you look at some standard leadership theories like transformational and transactional leadership theory, neither of them is morally superior if you have an autonomous will.
I think that's right. I think that's the... I think it fits in perfectly with what I was trying to suggest, that once you admit that the will can be autonomous, then it leaves it open to people to make these kinds of choices for themselves, and they find themselves in relationships where they can be loyal to others or whatever else. Kingdom of Ends, that's the third version, the categorical imperative. It's the one I always avoid. And I think it's harder to know what to do with it. It's,
It sounds like you're moving in that way, because if you take the equality of leaders and followers, you do end up with
Yeah.
this description of kingdom.
yeah, I mean, I think there's, once it's all grounded in autonomy, then it does look like, in a way, you're all in it together. And, yeah.
Okay, we've
Good point.
got
Thank you.
Jean and Gil.
I was just thinking, if we focus on people as constituents rather than followers, it gives us a little way out in this sense. That constituent, I thought, thinking, being, I think, too proud of my study of Latin and the realistic theory. I thought that constituent would mean stand together, and I looked it up. It doesn't mean that. It means to found together or to establish together. And if we think of ourselves as co-establishers in some end, in some entity, in some process that we're about, then it seems to me we have a responsibility to protect that. We have as much responsibility to protect that, the integrity of that goal, as the leader has. And we have a responsibility to correct the leader when the leader is wrong.
Given that my discipline is public administration, I'd like to address George, and that is, I think if we're going to look at the ethical dimensions of this, we should start with Weber himself, who really said that the ultimate end of bureaucracy, if you use the ideal type, is that it will bound the administrators in chains, it will turn them into impotent dilettantes, etc., etc. So he starts to warn of the end of using the ideal type to its extreme. And of course, the ideal type was developed to promote efficiency, but it has a moral downside that he recognized, and I think that's where we should start with that. And he's not, I don't think bureaucracy or efficiency really allows people to say we can't deal with the moral ends of what we're doing. As a matter of fact, that would be really problematic even for Baker. So I think we should go back to him to move forward in our analysis of the ethical implications.
Well, I agree, and I think you see the echo of Weber in Adams and Balfour's work, because whereas Weber called upon charismatic leadership as a solution to that, leadership as a solution to that, Adams and Balfour call upon the solution to be public administrators themselves, because they are at a place in the organizational hierarchy where they have a view, where they can see the downstream effects, and therefore if they look, they will see it. That's one of their major solutions. Put it in the hands of the leadership. It's their responsibility. Now, I think that's a limited approach, but it's obviously one that's reflected in their book, which is an echo, perhaps.
Oh, we need to bring things to a close. Thank you for attending the session and for good comments and feedback. Have good comments.